I'm BERNINA expert Amanda Murphy, and I'd like to show you how to quilt the first 2 blocks of my BERNINA Blossom sampler. We'll begin by basting our quilt top together. So lay your backing and your batting and your quilt top, and I pin basted my top. If you pin baste, make sure your pins are relatively close together, no more than a fist widths apart. You can certainly also spray baste your sampler if you prefer, or if you have a Q series, you could use the basting feature on that machine to baste your quilt. If you're on a domestic machine or a sit-down Q series, I recommend basting all the way around the quilt top. I baste in the area that will later be covered by the binding. You have 2 options here. You can either use fairly long basting stitches, or you can practice your stitch length for the rest of the quilt. So here, note that both of my hands are on the ruler, and I have a couple fingers from each hand on the ruler and a couple fingers from each hand on the fabric. Now I'm having to remove the pins as I come to them, because when the ruler sits over the pins, there's not good adherence to the quilt sandwich itself. And I'm basically going for a steady speed. So I move down the ruler, I stitch a little more, and in this case, again, my stitches are covered, so I actually can do pretty big stitches. As I get more practice, I can go a little faster. I do this so my backing doesn't peel away from the rest of the quilt top and get caught in the subsequent stitching. So now I'm going to quilt around the border. So 1 stitch brings the bobbin thread up, needle down, needle up, presser foot up, and then I begin sewing to bring my foot down. The ruler only comes over after the foot is down. So as I begin stitching, I'm doing very tiny stitches, almost in place but not quite, to lock those threads. And then over the first inch or so, I gradually increase my stitch length. I'm going to go ahead and clip these threads, but I'll show you another method for starting and ending threads later in the sampler. So now I'm going to try to go at a steady stitch length, a stitch length that would look like it was between a 2.5 and a 3.0 on a domestic machine if you were using a walking foot. You'll note that both of my hands are on the ruler, and a couple fingers from each hand are on the ruler, and a couple fingers from each hand are on the fabric. And this really stabilizes the quilt top and gives me much more control. The minute I feel like I don't have control, I stop. Now you'll tend to stitch a little faster in this direction because it's the direction you normally sew, but actually you want to try to stay steady in all directions. It will really help with your stitch length. Next, we're going to stabilize the blocks by quilting around them. So I'm starting with 1 stitch, needle down, needle up, presser foot up, and holding on to both threads. And then I start stitching. Note that the ruler doesn't come over until the foot's down. And when I'm stitching around the block, I want to stitch right on the inside because I'm using white thread. So I'm actually stitching along the ditch rather than in the ditch, if you want to get technical. When I was quilting with the border, I had that same white thread because I was lazy. So I actually quilted a little more toward the border side. So now my ruler is safe to come over, my foot is down, and I can begin to sew. Now I have my machine set up with a flat table, so I'm able to quilt a little more without repositioning my hands. If I had a curved table on, I would need to reposition my hands a little more. And I'm trying to establish that steady stitch speed. And when I get to the end of the ruler, I need to stop and reposition my hands. So I'm coming to the end of the line here. And now it's time to go the other direction. Now you'll note, when I change the direction, I simply rotate my ruler. I don't rotate my quilt top. Now I know on a quilt this size, it's easy to rotate your quilt top, but it isn't always easy to rotate your quilt top. Now note I'm going the other direction. Again, I rotated my ruler, and I'm holding my ruler on the side where I've already removed the pins. So that's how you stitch around all of your blocks right on the inside of the line. Next, it's time to mark my block. So I'm going to take a long cutting ruler and mark a diagonal with a water-soluble pen, but I'm going to mark very, very lightly. I need a diagonal in both directions. Normally, if I'm working with colored fabric, I like to use white chalk, but I do use these water-soluble pens sometimes. I just make sure to mark really lightly so that it's more likely to come out, because we really don't know what's going to happen to these products in 100 years. So now I'm going to mark a vertical and a horizontal through the center of the block. I'm going to use these placement lines for my rulers in the next step. I've put together a PDF for you on We All Sew so that you can see the quilting instructions step by step. But right here, I'm quilting the first block. So I'm starting in the center of the sampler and I'm doing needle down, needle up, presser foot up. And I'm bringing up that bobbin thread. Now I don't bring over my ruler yet. I make sure my foot is down. I'm going to start to sew to do that before my ruler comes over, and I'm using one of my every circle rulers, the 5-inch ruler. You can use a different circle ruler if you'd like, but regardless of which ruler you use, make sure the circle is centered to the line you drew. So I have my midline of this circle ruler right on top of one of those spokes. I know it's difficult to see because I marked lightly, but it's better to mark lightly than mark too dark and have difficulty getting the mark out. Again, I'm securing my threads using the modern method of doing tiny stitches as I begin to quilt. I'll show you an alternative method later in this video. I'm trying to establish a steady stitch length, and you'll note I only stitch as far as I can when I still have control. Once I lose control, I stop, I reposition my hands, and I continue on. I might reposition my hands 4 or 5 times to get around the circle, and that's completely normal. If you are struggling with maintaining a steady stitch length, try moving your speed slider down to about 25% of normal speed, and then floor the foot pedal, and that might make you more steady. But don't be in a hurry. Don't feel rushed. Just try to move smoothly. Sometimes music can help with this, or a podcast. Now when I get to this point, I'm clipping the threads because remember I did those securing stitches, but I'm also looking at the edge of that ruler, and I'm making sure that the edge of that ruler is a 1/4 inch away from that starting point. If it is not, the time to correct it would be before I reach that point. Now, I'm stopping here, rotating the ruler, and this time the vertical line on the ruler is going to be over the next spoke, and the spoke's very faint, of course, but the vertical line of the ruler is on it. You can see that really well in the PDF that I did. So here we go. We're going to stitch around again. I want you to note that I did not change directions. I kept going clockwise around, and that's because if I had switched and gone counterclockwise, in this instance, it would have made a corner in the center of the quilt, and you get too many corners, it's hard to make that center look nice. I only stitch as far as I can, and then I stop and I reposition my hands. When you start and stop, try not to jump the machine, and by that I mean make sure you push your foot pedal and you see that needle move before you move your hands. That's what will prevent jump stitches. Now I'm getting ready to close that last circle, and the people out there who are left brain will notice that I somehow reversed direction when I was quilting one of the circles. You don't want to do that. You want to keep going the same direction. I actually did not even notice I did that until I finished filming this video. So I'm checking just that as I close that circle that I'm actually going to end at the right point, so that the edge of my ruler is a 1/4 inch away from the point I'm trying to hit, and then I'm going to do those tiny, tiny stitches. Time to end our threads. So raise up the presser foot and grab onto the top thread. Do one more stitch. So needle down, needle up, presser foot up. I'm using the buttons. And then pull on both the top thread and the thread coming out of the needle in opposite directions, and that's my bobbin thread. Now because I did the tiny stitches, I can clip those threads. But as I said, for the next block, I'm going to show you another method. Next, I'm going to show you the alternative method for starting and ending your threads, and this is the method you should use with show quilts that are going to be judged. So needle down, needle up, presser foot up, and I'm actually bringing my needle down to make sure I'll be right in the center of the block. I don't have to worry about the needle part crashing into the foot because Bernina was smart enough to put a spring in the foot to prevent that from happening. So now I'm going to quilt over and under this curve. And I'm going to use the line on the ruler right over my marked line on the fabric to create some consistency. So another way to do this design, this petal design that I'm going to create, if you don't have a curved ruler that has marks like this, would be to mark every 5 inches or every 4 inches from the center of your spokes, right? The center of your design, and quilt out to that mark using a curved ruler. I don't have to do those marks because I'm using the lines on the ruler. So now I need to go ahead and move that pin because it's impeding my progress, and I'm going to put the ruler back on, and I'm going to stick with that same line, but this time I'm going to quilt under the ruler back to the center point. And you'll note that the center point is a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the ruler. If my ruler slipped while I was quilting, it would be important to correct its alignment before I got to the ending point. So I probably would want to correct the alignment in the flattest part of the curve if possible. So I'm coming back to the center, and I'm really going to be strategic about where I go next. So instead of quilting out the next petal at 90 degrees, I'm going to go across the way, because if I quilt an S-curve and my alignment's a little off, it's much less noticeable than if I quilt a corner and my alignment is off, and that's important. That's something I've learned from making a lot of mistakes. So now I'm going to quilt the opposite direction over my ruler and then under my ruler. And as I come back to center, I'm now going to try to keep the curve as best I can. So instead of backing out and going the way I came, I'm going to continue that curve and do the next petal. So now I'm finishing that last petal and moving back to the center. I kept my threads long, my beginning threads long, and I'm going to do the same when I end this thread. So I'm getting right back to the center point, no tiny stitches this time. Needle up, presser foot up, grab that thread, do one more stitch. So needle down, needle up, presser foot up. You can use your heel button to do that if you would like, and pull on that top thread, and that's what brings the bobbin thread to the top. Now this time, I never did those securing stitches, so I need to bring that bobbin thread way, 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 way out, like 4 inches, 5 inches. And now I have all those threads together, and it's time to make my knot. So you can make a square knot or you can make a quilter's knot, and I am using my finger to keep it close to the fabric. And then I thread it into a chenille needle. You can also use a self-threading needle. I just find the chenille needles are really easy, and I just fold it over and thread them in. They have the really big eyes, but they still have a sharp point. Now, I'm going to thread it through the fabric right at the point that all those threads came out. And I'm going to pull it through. My hand's blocking you a little here, but until that knot pops into the fabric. And then when the knot pops in, I can go ahead and clip those threads. And that's what you want to do for show quilts. I changed my thread color. I did the exact same thing on the diagonal lines in a different thread color. You don't have to change your thread color. You can do all of block 1 on every block if you want. You could change color with every petal, but I think that's kind of crazy. But feel free to make this design your own. So I brought up my bobbin thread, leaving it fairly long, and then I knotted my threads and buried them in my quilt sandwich. I decided to echo this design with a 1/4 inch echo, and to do that, I used the smallest of the BERNINA echo clips. So you simply slide them on the 72 foot. If you have resistance, you probably have it upside down. So slide them on your 72 foot and then mount the foot on the machine. The echo clip will add a 1/4 inch between your needle and your stitched line. So if I'm using the same ruler and I have an echo clip on my foot, it will produce an echo that is 1/4 inch away from my original stitched line. So I'm bringing up my bobbin thread just like before, and I do a stitch to get the needle down, and then I'm using that same ruler in the same alignment, and I'm going to quilt along it, and you'll see we get an echo that it's 1/4 inch. I stop when I'm on the marked line. I know that's the perfect pivot point, and then I quilt down again. Once you're done, bring up your bobbin thread, knot your threads, and bury them. If you'd like, you can go back and quilt an echo around the motif you made in block number 1. You can also experiment with the different size echo clips for different effects. Feel free to join me every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern for more quilting tips in my Facebook group, Quilting with Amanda Murphy. I'll see you next time to finish our Bernina Blossoms sampler.